Just before victory, everything seems under control. Years of training, thousands of repetitions, a lifetime preparing for that instant. Then, in the most important second, everything fails. Why does someone so prepared crumble under pressure? Why does the mind betray us when we need it most? And most unsettling, why does this happen not only to athletes, but also to students, artists, and ordinary professionals? To understand it, we must first look head-on at a devastating psychological phenomenon. Imagine your favorite athlete just seconds away from victory. The stadium falls silent, the crowd holds its breath, the moment is perfect. But then the unthinkable happens. They fail, not for lack of talent, not because of bad luck, but because they have just experienced something much deeper and more common than we think. Choking under pressure, collapsing under pressure. This phenomenon describes those moments when, just when performance matters more than ever, the mind seems to disconnect. Years of practice, discipline, and experience become useless in an instant. And although we usually associate it with sports, the reality is that it appears in many other scenarios. A speaker who goes blank in the middle of a lecture, a musician who forgets their notes in a live concert, a brilliant student who fails to answer simple questions on a decisive exam. The question is inevitable. How can someone so prepared fail so drastically? The answer doesn't lie in a lack of capability, but in the way pressure alters the workings of the mind. Under extreme stress, the brain doesn't act the same way. What normally flows automatically becomes rigid, forced, unstable. Pressure transforms a familiar situation into a threat. Fear of failure, dread of external judgment, anxiety about the consequences appear. And when that happens, performance no longer depends on skill alone. At that point, something much more fragile comes into play: attention. To understand why even experts crumble under pressure, researchers have identified two fundamental psychological explanations. Two different paths that lead to the same result: mental blocking at the crucial moment. In the next part, we will explore the first one, a theory that explains how the mind, saturated by fear and anxiety, loses its ability to concentrate when it needs to most. The first explanation for why people crumble under pressure is known as the distraction theory. According to this idea, the problem isn't a lack of skill, but rather mental overload. When a person faces a high-stress situation, their mind fills with competing thoughts: fear of failure, doubts about their own performance, worry about the opinions of others. And amidst that internal chaos, concentrating becomes almost impossible. The brain has a limited capacity to process information. Under normal conditions, that capacity is used to execute the task: solving a problem, remembering information, coordinating movements. But under pressure, a large portion of those resources is diverted toward irrelevant but emotionally intense thoughts. The result is inferior performance, not because the person doesn't know what to do, but because their attention is hijacked. This effect becomes especially evident in tasks that require working memory, the mental space we use to think, reason, and handle information at the same time. Solving a complex math problem, remembering a sequence of data, or making quick decisions depends directly on that memory. And when pressure appears, that system is severely affected. A study conducted in 2004 demonstrated this clearly. A group of university students was assigned math problems of varying difficulty. Half solved them in a quiet environment, while the other half did so under pressure. On simple exercises, both groups achieved similar results. But when the task required more memory and concentration, the students subjected to stress performed much worse. The pressure didn't make them less intelligent. It simply occupied the mental space they needed to think clearly. It's like trying to solve a complex problem while someone is constantly shouting in your ear. No matter how capable you are, your mind cannot function properly. Thus, choking under pressure is not born of a vacuum, but of excess. Too many thoughts, too much anxiety, too much attention focused on what could go wrong. But this is not the only way pressure sabotages performance. There is a second explanation, just as powerful, which shows how thinking too much can also be destructive. The second explanation for collapsing under pressure is known as the explicit monitoring theory. Unlike distraction, The problem here is not that the mind drifts, but quite the opposite. It focuses too much on what it shouldn't. When a skill has been practiced for years, its execution becomes automatic. The body knows what to do without the need for conscious instructions. However, under pressure, many people begin to observe and analyze every small step of their action. What once flowed naturally becomes a rigid, enforced sequence. The mind interferes where it isn't needed. Imagine a basketball player who has shot thousands of free throws in practice. Under normal conditions, the movement is almost instinctive. But in a decisive game, with a close score and thousands of eyes on them, they start thinking about the position of their feet, the angle of their arm, the force of the shot. That excess of conscious control breaks the rhythm and alters coordination. A study with golfers demonstrated this effect clearly. When they were asked to focus on the flight of the ball, their performance improved. But when they were instructed to pay attention to the exact movement of their arms, their shots worsened notably. Thinking too much about the mechanics of a well-learned action proved harmful. Under pressure, the mind tries to ensure success by reviewing every detail. But that attempt at control ends up being the greatest enemy of performance. Attention shifts from the result to the process, and in that shift, naturalness is lost. Thus, choking arises not only from being distracted, but also from being excessively self-focused. Both theories lead to the same inevitable question. If pressure can destroy performance in this way, is it possible to avoid it? Or are we doomed to fail when it matters most? After understanding how distraction and excess conscious control sabotage performance, a troubling question arises. Is failing under pressure inevitable? The answer, according to research, is no. But it's also not as simple as staying calm. Studies show that not everyone reacts to pressure in the same way. Some people are more prone to choking than others, especially those who tend to be more self-conscious, anxious, or who intensely fear external judgment. For them, pressure is not just a challenge, but a constant threat to their identity and self-esteem. However, this vulnerability is not a final sentence. The brain is flexible and can learn to respond differently. The key lies in understanding that pressure isn't eliminated. It's trained. Just as muscles adapt to physical effort, the mind can adapt to psychological stress if exposed to it properly. Instead of avoiding stressful situations, people who perform best under pressure have usually developed a different relationship with it. They don't interpret pressure as a signal of danger, but as a natural part of performance. That difference in perception completely changes the mental and emotional response. Based on this idea, researchers began exploring concrete strategies to strengthen the mind against stress. Practical methods based on scientific evidence that allow performance to be maintained even when anxiety appears. The first of these starts with a simple but powerful idea: training in exactly the conditions we fear most. One of the most effective strategies to avoid collapsing under pressure is, paradoxically, to expose oneself to it during training. Instead of always practicing in comfortable and controlled conditions, some researchers propose something different: simulating real stress before the decisive moment arrives. A study with expert dart players put this idea to the test. All participants had a high level of skill, but they didn't all train the same way. Some practiced in quiet environments, while others did so under conditions designed to generate anxiety, such as the presence of observers or pressure over the result. When the time came to perform under real stress, the results were clear. Those who had trained under pressure maintained a much more stable performance when anxiety appeared. The explanation is simple yet profound. The brain learns to normalize stress when it faces it repeatedly. What initially feels like a threat becomes a familiar situation over time. Thus, pressure stops hijacking attention and loses some of its power. This type of training not only prepares technical skill, but also the emotional response. Students who take practice exams in conditions similar to the real thing, speakers who rehearse in front of an audience, or musicians who simulate full concerts are training more than just their performance. They are training their mind not to collapse. But exposure to stress by itself is not always enough. Even people accustomed to pressure need tools that help them maintain focus at the critical moment. And here, a second key strategy comes into play: pre-performance routines. When pressure increases, the mind tends to wander or to over-control everything. Pre-performance routines function as an anchor that keeps attention in the right place. They are not simple superstitions or mindless habits. They are psychological tools that help stabilize focus just before acting. These routines can take many forms. Deep breaths, repeating a keyword, following a specific sequence of movements or gestures. The important thing is not the exact content of the ritual, but its consistency. By repeating the same routine over and over, the brain learns to associate it with a state of calm and concentration. Various studies in sports like bowling, golf, and even water polo have shown that athletes who use structured routines perform more consistently and accurately under pressure. The routine reduces uncertainty and limits the mental space available for intrusive thoughts. Instead of worrying about the result or external judgment, attention is centered on a known sequence. These practices also help combat both distraction and excessive monitoring. On one hand, they keep the mind occupied with something concrete, preventing anxiety from invading it. On the other, they prevent the detailed analysis of every movement, allowing automatic skills to do their job. In high-pressure situations, mental stability is just as important as technical skill. And routines offer exactly that, a sense of control amidst the chaos. However, there is still one final strategy, perhaps the most subtle of all, that can make the difference between collapse and optimal performance. The final strategy to combat collapsing under pressure does not consist of doing more, but of directing attention differently. Instead of focusing on oneself and every detail of the execution, researchers discovered that shifting focus outward can significantly improve performance. Under pressure, many people fall into the trap of observing every movement, every decision, every possible mistake. This internal attention intensifies explicit monitoring and breaks the fluidity of skills that are already well learned. Shifting focus means stopping the monitoring of the process and concentrating on the final goal. A study with golfers illustrated this clearly. Those who focused on the flight of the ball, that is, on the result of the shot, achieved superior performance. In contrast, those who centered their attention on the movement of their arms, on the exact mechanics of the stroke, had worse results. The difference was not in the technique, but in where the attention was placed. This principle applies to many areas. A speaker who concentrates on delivering a message, rather than analyzing every word they pronounce. A musician who focuses on the sound they want to create, not on the exact position of their fingers. By looking outward, the mind allows the body to do what it has already been trained for. Keeping one's eyes on the goal, and not on the steps to reach it, reduces mental interference. The pressure doesn't disappear, but it loses its ability to paralyze. And with this final piece, the puzzle of performance under pressure begins to close. After going through the causes and solutions of collapsing under pressure, one idea remains clear. Failing in the decisive moment is not a sign of weakness or lack of talent. It is the result of how the mind responds to stress when attention is altered. Whether through distraction or excessive control, pressure changes how we access our own skills. The good news is that this process is not immutable. Research shows that performance under pressure can be trained. Exposing oneself to stress during practice, establishing pre-performance routines, and directing attention toward the goal rather than toward oneself allows the mind to function more stably when it matters most. Perhaps then, the famous phrase should be reconsidered. It's not just that practice makes perfect. The true formula for success consists of practicing under pressure, protecting focus, and keeping one's eyes on the goal. Because in decisive moments, it's not the one who thinks more who wins, but the one who manages to let their training speak for itself.